Dion, you need to step out. It's Houston Police.
When you hear the term craziest police shootings, you might think it's straight out of a wild action movie. However, today we'll have a look at some very real instances of police shootings that got completely out of control. From high-speed chases to intense standoffs, join us as we have a look at the craziest police shootings ever. The chase and tragic ending of Sean Reed. This was a regular day that turned into a heart-pounding chase, and it was all streamed live for the world to see. That's exactly what took place in the case of Sean Reed. It begins with Sean driving, carefree and shirtless, engaging with followers on Facebook Live. There was music in the background and he was singing along, occasionally glancing at his rearview mirror, but this wasn't any casual drive. Sean was actually being chased by the police. He had reportedly driven recklessly at an intersection, and what began as a minor traffic stop spiraled into a high-speed pursuit. As the chase would escalate, his demeanor shifted from amusement to defiance. He abandoned his car, deciding to continue on foot, perhaps believing he could outmaneuver the police. But the situation took a dark turn the moment that he stepped out of his vehicle, and suddenly, the playful banter stopped, and the atmosphere grew tense. The police shouted commands, and Sean, still live streaming, would respond with a derogatory remark, and in a matter of moments the screen froze as the sound of gunshots filled the air. The live audience of over 5,000 viewers would be left in shock and disbelief because Sean Reed's life had ended in that moment. The aftermath of the shooting was as controversial as the chase itself. One police officer was recorded making a joke, which led to his suspension and reassignment. While a grand jury dropped the charges against the officer who shot Sean, citing evidence that he was armed and had fired at the police, this didn't quell the public's outcry. Protests would erupt with people demanding justice and answers, and Sean's family refuted the claims that he was armed, painting a picture of a young man whose life was cut short under questionable circumstance. To all those who witnessed the final moments, it was more than just a chase. It was a tragic unfolding of events that raised numerous questions about police tactics, the use of force, and the role of social media in documenting such critical moments. Sean's story became a symbol of a larger conversation, one that would continue to echo in the streets and in the hearts of those who demanded change. The Kehoe Brothers Showdown. Now we turn the page to a story that seems like it's straight out of a Hollywood action movie, but this one's all too real. The Kehoe brothers, Chevy and Cheney, notorious for ties to a white supremacist gang, had etched their names into the annals of crazy police shootouts with not one, but two confrontations on the same day. February 15th of 1997, Chevy would be behind the wheel of a blue Suburban when a highway patrol trooper noticed an expired license plate. Little did that trooper know the routine stop was a prelude to a chaotic showdown. Chevy was already on the police radar for a brutal murder he had committed, which included an 8-year-old girl, and when the officer commenced to do a pat-down, Chevy chose to bolt for his van instead. That's when things spiraled out of control. Cheney, who had been silently observing from the passenger seat, suddenly opened fire through the window. Imagine the shock of officers as the bullets flew from what was supposed to be a routine stop. The officers trained for such moments returned fire, and for a few intense moments, it was a full-blown shootout. With the officer's attention being diverted, Chevy saw his chance. He leapt into the van and sped away, leaving his brother to fend for himself. Cheney, meanwhile, took cover in bushes, continuing to exchange gunfire with police, and the first encounter ended as abruptly as it began, with the brothers managing to escape, leaving behind a chaotic scene straight out of a war zone. But the day's drama would not be over yet. Another officer spotted the blue Suburban, and another gunfight would break out. Nothing short of miraculous that the officer escaped unscathed. After the intense exchange, Chevy abandoned the weapon and fled on foot. In their run for the law did not last long. 4 months later, the law would finally catch up with the brothers, and Cheney, perhaps sensing the futility of further resistance, had turned himself in and led the police to Chevy. The court would be unforgiving, giving Chevy 3 consecutive life sentences, while Cheney, who had cooperated, got 28 years behind bars. Bradley Olson's repeated escapades. Now we shift to talk about Bradley Olson, a man whose life seemed like it was ripped straight from the script of a fast-paced action movie. Olson was notorious for his involvement in high-speed chases and police confrontations and turned the streets into his own personal stage for an adrenaline-fueled drama. Before his final and fatal encounter, he'd had a history that was peppered with chases and narrow escapes. Like a cat with 9 lives, he had always managed to slip through the fingers of the law. Convicted on multiple occasions, he had a knack for evading police custody. It was as if he thrived on the thrill of the chase, becoming increasingly bold with each escape. His recklessness would come to an ending in November of 2020. He would be flagged down by an officer for reckless driving and decided to make a run for it. But this time, there was a twist. He was not alone. A female passenger was in the car, and Olson had a gun, signaling his willingness to take this chase to a dangerous level. As the police pursued him, he fired through the rear window at officers, an indication he was not going down without a fight. The chase would quickly escalate with other officers joining in, and it took a complex turn when his passenger dialed 911, reporting that he was threatening to shoot her. The stakes were high, and police had to tread carefully because one misstep could put the passenger's life in jeopardy. Eventually, he crashed at an intersection, and with no way out, he became desperate and violent, firing several rounds at officers who had to take cover. The police body cam footage would capture the intense moments of the standoff. A rookie cop's voice saying that he's shooting underscored the gravity of the situation. Despite being arrested and charged, he was released on bail, a decision that would later be questioned. Known to be a flight risk with a history of evading police, he never showed up for his court date. He then reappeared on the police radar, even more brazen than ever, and led to another high-speed chase, where that time he attempted a carjacking, but the police were quicker. They opened fire, critically wounding him, and he would be pronounced dead at the hospital. His repeated escapades highlight the fine line between law enforcement and the unpredictability of those who choose to live life on the edge. His story is a blending of recklessness, danger, and the relentless pursuit of justice. A true testament to the challenges faced by police officers in their daily encounters with the unpredictable. The fatal confrontation with Deon Ledette. When it comes to police shootouts, the story of Deon Ledette stands out, not only for violence, but also for a complex web of events that led to a tragic ending. 30-year-old Ledette was a man with a history of brushes with the law and became the central figure in a deadly confrontation that raised a lot of questions about crime, policing, and the thin line between enforcement and survival. In September of 2021, officers from the Houston Police Department arrived at his residence. Their mission would be straightforward: serving an arrest warrant for drug-related charges. Ledette, however, had other plans. Known for evading arrest and aggravated assault, he was not going to go down easily. Imagine the tension in the air as officers knocked on his door. A woman would answer, and they asked her to step outside, standard procedure in such a scenario. Officers called out for Ledette, and what followed next would be a rapid, unexpected turn of events. Suddenly, gunshots echoed throughout the apartment. 2 officers were hit immediately, and the bullets struck with lethal precision. Senior police officer William Jeffrey took a direct hit and fell, while Sergeant Vance tried to crawl away from the hail of bullets. The other officers would scramble for cover, returning fire, but their target was obscured. In the chaos, they knew that they had to neutralize Ledette to save their colleagues and themselves. But how do you fight an unseen enemy who has nothing to lose? The shooting would continue, and the air was full of gunpowder and uncertainty. The standoff eventually came to a head when officers managed to down Ledette. The aftermath would be grim. One officer had lost his life, and Ledette was pronounced dead. The incident left a scar not only on officers involved, but also on the community. A stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of police work, where a routine operation can turn deadly in a heartbeat. Paul Palafox's last stand. Paul Palafox's story is one of those incidents that makes you wonder how a simple argument can spiral into an explosive confrontation. In March of 2023 in San Antonio, Texas, a heated dispute over money turned deadly, bringing 4 police officers face-to-face with a heavily armed Palafox. The day begins with an argument over an unfulfilled financial promise with another person, but it was more than just words exchanged. Palafox took it a step further, shooting the man in the leg before driving home. Police responded to the shooting at the car wash and then found Palafox at his house. Imagine scenes as officers arrived, their body cameras capturing the initial moments of calm before the storm. One officer tried to engage with Paul, who was already on edge. but he remained unresponsive to the officer's attempts at de-escalation and had something else in mind. Suddenly, he drew his weapon, and the officer immediately drew his, warning Palafox not to make a move. It was too late, however, because Palafox, armed with an AR-15, opened fire on the officers who were only equipped with handguns. They would scramble for cover, realizing they had been outgunned. Palafox had the advantage, and wedged between two cars, he fired over 26 rounds at police. Officers, despite the tactical disadvantage, had maintained position, firing back when they could. Body camera footage would reveal the chaos of the intense moment, with one officer shouting to the others about his weapon. In what felt like an eternity, the one-sided shootout ended with Palafox critically wounded. He was rushed to the hospital but later pronounced dead. Kenneth Hearn's final encounter. The story of Kenneth Hearn is a tale marked with evasion, confrontation, and a tragic finale. Hearn was 37 years old and became the focus of a significant investigation following a disturbing incident that occurred in October of 2022. It began with sexual assault, where the suspect entered an apartment through an open patio door, an act that would be caught on camera. This footage led to the Scottsdale Police Department directly contacting Hearn and making him a prime suspect. As the police would zero in, they were dealing with a man who knew he was wanted and was doing everything possible to stay out of reach. Despite their attempts to contact him, he remained elusive, avoiding any encounters with the law. But when the police finally caught up to him, they decided to act swiftly and decisively. The scene was set for a confrontation with each officer aware of the potential danger. They knocked on the door, announcing they had a search warrant. A woman answered and was safely removed from the apartment along with a child, a standard procedure to ensure civilian safety. The officers would repeatedly announce their presence, urging Hearn to come forward, but he was hiding inside and not willing to surrender. Things quickly escalated when Hearn opened fire through the wall, striking one of the officers, and the response would be immediate and intense. Officers returned fire, and within moments the standoff ended with Hearn escaping. However, his freedom would be short-lived. The next day, he would be spotted in a parking complex by a police officer and again chose confrontation over surrender. The officers initially fired upon him with non-lethal rounds, but he attempted to pull a handgun, and they had no choice but to respond with lethal force. He would be shot and later pronounced dead. Morris Richard Jones III's deadly trap. The case of Morris Richard Jones III is a chilling tale of deception and violence, and a reminder of the unpredictable dangers that police officers face. On February the 11th of 2022, a 911 call reported a woman being shot. The first officer on the scene was about to step into a meticulously laid trap. As the officer approached the house, he was greeted by a man who appeared frantic, urging him to hurry because the woman was supposedly dying inside. With a sense of urgency, they moved towards the man, unaware of the looming threat. It was a scene that could have been straight out of a suspense thriller, except it was a grim reality. In a shocking twist, as the officer asked if anyone else was inside, the man suddenly revealed a hidden handgun and fired at the officer at close range. Caught completely off guard, the officer was wounded and managed to retreat and call for backup. The quiet of the early morning was shattered by this unexpected action of violence. The situation rapidly escalates when more officers arrive. The gunman, now barricaded inside, had turned a domestic call into a deadly standoff. In a turn of events that seemed like a cruel twist of fate, the door opens and a man emerges holding a baby. Following the officer's commands, they placed the baby on the ground and was detained, but this act was merely a prelude to future horror. As officers rushed to secure the baby, Jones would seize the moment to open fire once again. In the ensuing chaos, a total of 9 police officers would be injured, some by direct gunfire and others by shrapnel and ricochet. The standoff would last for several hours, ending tragically with Jones taking his own life. Jonathan Magana's last battle. Jonathan Magana's story is an illustration of how a life of crime can spiral into a deadly ending. 32-year-old Magana had a history that reads like a script from a crime drama. He had previously been sentenced to 5 years for robbery, but was released early for good behavior. However, his freedom would be short-lived, as he quickly found himself back on the police radar. In March of 2023, his life reached a fateful turning point. He was now holed up in an uncompleted building, with the Los Angeles Police Department closing in. The officers had been alerted to his location and arrived, prepared for a potentially dangerous encounter. Body camera footage from the scene would reveal the tense moments that unfolded. As officers attempted to make contact, warning him both in English and Spanish, it became apparent he was not going to surrender peacefully. The officers were well aware of his criminal history and the possibility that he could be armed, and their calls to him for surrender were met with a silence that was both ominous and foreboding. In an effort to force him out, officers deployed a chemical agent, and this action triggered a violent response. Magana began shooting at officers from inside the building, and they found themselves in the line of fire, returning shots while strategically retreating. The body camera captured the chaos of the urgency of the moment, with one officer being hit and urgently calling for help. The SWAT team was then called in, and like a scene out of a movie, they tried to negotiate, but there was no response. They then employed a robotic device with a camera to scan the room, and what they found would mark a tragic ending: Magana immobilized by multiple gunshot wounds. He would then be taken to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. The incident had left 3 officers injured, a reminder of the risks that they face every day. The final confrontation was more than just a shootout. It was a tragic culmination of a life led astray and the hard and often dangerous work of law enforcement in managing such volatile situations. James Harrison's desperate end. The story of James Harrison is one of tragedy, blending elements of personal turmoil and the law enforcement's relentless pursuit. 52-year-old Harrison became the central figure in an ultimately fatal police chase, a story that began with a disturbing action and ended in a deadly confrontation. Harrison's spiral to infamy began when his neighbor, Thomas May, had caught him peeping at his 15-year-old daughter through her bedroom window. This unsettling discovery would set off a series of events, leading to a harrowing ending. May, hearing noises outside the window, would be shocked to find Harrison with a ladder, invading their privacy. Upon being discovered, he fled. The following day, the situation took a darker turn. The neighborhood awoke to the news of a double homicide. Both Harrison's mother and Thomas May were found dead, each with a fatal gunshot wound to the head. May's daughter, though shot, miraculously survived and laid on the front lawn, a testament to the night's horrors. And when the police officers would arrive, their primary objective shifted from issuing a trespass notice to apprehending a murder suspect. Harrison would be spotted leaving the area in a dark blue car, and what followed became a tense and dangerous pursuit, with Harrison leading the police through several neighborhoods in desperation. The chase would reach its climax when Harrison, attempting to evade capture, had crashed his car. Officers quickly surrounded him, and the standoff lasted several minutes. Harrison was cornered and seemingly out of options, and made a fateful decision, pointing his weapon at the officers and prompting them to open fire. The scene would be chaotic, with multiple officers firing simultaneously. Harrison did not survive the encounter, and the question of who had delivered the fatal shot would remain unclear. However, the collective action of officers was a response to an immediate and deadly threat. Brian Simonton's tragic outcome. Brian Simonton's story is a heart-wrenching example of how personal crises can escalate into public tragedy, culminating in the deadly police encounter. 37-year-old Simonton had faced a downward spiral that led to a fateful clash with law enforcement in Ogden, Utah. The incident begins with a distressing 911 call from a woman who was Simonton's ex. She reported that he had violated a restraining order, showing up unannounced at her apartment, and her voice indicated that he was acting erratically, possibly even suicidal, or seeking to provoke a lethal response from the police. She mentioned his homelessness and that he had brought his sick dog along, adding layers of complexity to his troubled state. Meanwhile, another resident called 911, warning that he was known to possess firearms and refusing to leave the premises. The police gathered information from the calls and knew they would be walking into a potentially volatile situation. The first officer to arrive immediately spotted Simonton in the parking lot, armed with a handgun. Body camera footage would show the tense moment that the officer ordered him to drop his weapon. However, he was trapped in his mental turmoil. He pointed his gun at the officer, who then takes cover. The officer's radio call for backup sets the stage for what would become a tragic confrontation. As more officers arrived, they would form a perimeter around him. And then, in a moment of desperation, he opened fire upon the police. Officers were faced with no other choice, and they returned fire while seeking cover. One officer would be hit during the exchange, and his calls for help were captured on camera. Despite all efforts, he was eventually shot and fell. Officers were cautious due to the proximity of his weapon, and they sent in a canine to ensure it was safe to approach him. Medical personnel attempted life-saving procedures, but he had succumbed to his injuries. Jeffrey Garvin's violent conclusion. Jeffrey Garvin's story is a tragic account of a domestic situation that escalated into a deadly confrontation with police. 43-year-old Garvin had no prior criminal record, but found himself at the center of a tense standoff on August 1st of 2019, an event that would end in violence and tragedy. This incident begins with a 911 call involving Garvin, who was reported to have threatened his wife. By the time the police arrived, the situation had taken a dark turn. Garvin had ingested pills and was armed with a gun and created a volatile and unpredictable scenario. As officers approached the scene, their body cams captured the tense atmosphere. Garvin's wife was visibly shaken and told the officers that her husband was in bed, speaking to his father on the phone with a shotgun beside him. Officers cautiously entered the house, weapons drawn and minds alert for any sudden movements. The situation turned dramatic when Garvin, instead of being in the bedroom, appeared downstairs. The officers would confront him and immediately instruct him to drop his weapon. However, his response was not compliant, and he engaged the officers with a hail of gunfire. In the chaos of the moment, one officer was hit twice on the arm, and both of the officers realized the severity of the situation, retreated, and called for backup. When the dust had settled, Garvin would be found dead. An autopsy would later suggest that although he had sustained gunshot wounds, the fatal injury would be self-inflicted.